Baby found a bear cub stuck in a coffee shop espresso machine. What Baby did next perked hearts. The morning mist clung to the windows of the small coffee shop like a soft blanket, and Ethan Marshall pushed through the door with his 18-month-old daughter Lily balanced on his hip. The bell above the door made its familiar chime, a sound that usually promised comfort and routine, but today something felt different in the air, though Ethan couldn't quite place what it was. The shop was empty except for Jessica Brooks behind the counter, her usual warm smile greeting them as she wiped down the already spotless surface with practiced movements. Lily squirmed in Ethan's arms, her tiny hands reaching toward the floor, and he set her down gently, watching as her unsteady feet carried her toward the corner where a basket of wooden toys usually kept her entertained during their morning visits. But today, Lily walked right past the toys, her attention fixed on something else entirely, something that made her stop and stare with the kind of focus only very young children possess when they discover something truly fascinating. The espresso machine stood against the wall like it always had, its chrome surface gleaming in the soft morning light, steam occasionally hissing from its various valves and pipes. It was a massive thing, an old Italian model that Jessica had inherited from her grandmother who'd opened the shop 40 years ago, and it had become as much a part of the shop's character as the mismatched chairs and the collection of local artwork on the walls. Ethan watched his daughter toddle toward it, expecting Jessica to gently redirect her as she usually did when Lily got too close to the equipment. But Jessica was staring at the machine too, her cleaning cloth frozen in midair, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to wonder. There was a sound coming from the machine, not the usual gurgle and hiss of brewing coffee, but something softer, something that sounded almost like whimpering, like a creature in distress trying to call for help without knowing how. Ethan moved closer, his protective instincts kicking in as he reached for Lily, but she was already pressing her small palms against the lower panel of the machine, her head tilted to one side as if listening to a secret only she could hear. The whimpering grew louder, more distinct, and now Ethan could hear it too, a sound that made no sense coming from a piece of kitchen equipment, a sound that belonged to something alive and afraid. Jessica came around the counter, moving slowly as if she was walking through a dream, and together they knelt beside Lily, all three of them now focused on the impossible sound emanating from within the metal beast. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to pause, holding its breath along with them, as Jessica reached for the maintenance panel she'd opened 1,000 times before, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked the familiar latches. What they saw when the panel swung open defied every expectation, every logical thought that tried to form in Ethan's mind. There, wedged between the copper pipes and the heating element, was a tiny paw covered in dark brown fur, and attached to that paw was the rest of a bear cub, no bigger than a house cat, its eyes wide with fear and confusion. The cub couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, its fur still carrying the soft fluffiness of infancy, and how it had gotten inside the machine was a mystery that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Jessica gasped, a soft sound that was more wonder than fear, and Lily clapped her hands together once, a gesture of pure delight that broke the spell of disbelief that had settled over the adults. The cub whimpered again, its free paw scrabbling against the metal interior, trying to find purchase, trying to free itself from a prison it couldn't understand. The logical part of Ethan's mind, the part that managed spreadsheets and quarterly reports in his day job, was screaming that this was impossible, that bear cubs don't appear in coffee shops, especially not inside espresso machines. But the evidence was right there before his eyes, breathing and whimpering and very much real. Jessica was already moving, her hands gentle but sure as she reached into the machine, speaking in the same soothing tone she used with nervous customers on busy mornings. The cub's eyes tracked her movements, and for a moment Ethan thought he saw something in those dark depths that looked almost like recognition, almost like trust. Lily had sat down on the floor, her legs crossed in that boneless way only toddlers can manage, watching the proceedings with the calm acceptance that children bring to miracles, as if finding bear cubs in coffee machines was just another part of the wonderful, mysterious world she was still discovering. The process of freeing the cub took time and patience, with Jessica carefully maneuvering around the hot pipes while Ethan held a flashlight to illuminate the dark interior. The cub had somehow gotten its paw caught in a gap between two panels, a space so small it seemed impossible that even a creature this tiny could have fit through it. As they worked, other early morning customers began to arrive, the bell above the door chiming repeatedly, but each person who entered quickly fell silent, drawn into the quiet drama unfolding by the espresso machine. Logan Carter, the town's veterinarian who always stopped for his double shot before opening his clinic, knelt beside them without a word, his trained hands joining Jessica's in the delicate operation. Savannah Reed, who ran the bookstore next door, appeared with a soft blanket from her shop's reading nook, ready to wrap the cub once it was free. The moment of liberation came suddenly, the cub's paw slipping free with an almost audible pop, and the tiny creature tumbled into Jessica's waiting hands. Instead of struggling or trying to escape, the cub went completely still. Its breathing rapid, but its body relaxed, as if it understood that these strange, tall creatures meant it no harm. Lily reached out one chubby finger, moving slowly the way Ethan had taught her to approach the neighbor's cat, and the cub turned its head to look at her. What happened next would stay with everyone in that coffee shop for the rest of their lives. A moment so pure and unexpected that it seemed to stop time itself. The cub leaned forward and gently touched its nose to Lily's finger. A gesture of connection that transcended species, age, and logic. A greeting between two young souls who hadn't yet learned that such meetings were supposed to be impossible. Logan examined the cub with professional efficiency, his hands moving over the small body, checking for injuries beyond the minor scrapes on its trapped paw. He found none, declaring the cub remarkably healthy despite its ordeal, though he couldn't hide his bewilderment at finding a black bear cub, a species not seen in this part of the state for decades, somehow materialized inside a coffee shop's espresso machine. The cub seemed content to stay in Jessica's lap, occasionally lifting its head to look around at the growing circle of faces, all wearing expressions of wonder mixed with confusion. Someone suggested calling animal control, but the words hung in the air, feeling wrong somehow, feeling like they would break whatever spell had brought this impossible moment into being. Instead, they all just sat there, forming a protective circle around Jessica, Lily, and the cub, as if by maintaining this formation they could keep the outside world and its rules and logic at bay for just a little longer. It was Lily who changed everything, as children often do with their simple, direct approach to the world. She stood up, walked over to the door, and pushed against it with her small hands, looking back at the cub with an expression that clearly said, "Come on." The cub lifted its head, made a small sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a purr, and struggled to its feet in Jessica's lap. Everyone watched, transfixed, as the tiny bear climbed down and padded over to Lily, its gait unsteady but determined. When Ethan opened the door, expecting the cub to run off into the morning, to disappear back into whatever mysterious realm it had emerged from, it did something else entirely. It sat down next to Lily and looked up at the adults, waiting, as if it had something important to show them, something that required their participation in whatever strange story was unfolding. The procession that followed would have looked absurd to any outside observer. A line of adults following a toddler and a bear cub through the quiet morning streets of the town. But there was something about the purposeful way the cub moved, stopping occasionally to make sure Lily was keeping up. That made it feel less like random wandering and more like a journey with a destination. They passed the pharmacy where Michael Hayes was just flipping the sign to open, and he joined them without question, falling into step as if he'd been expecting this all along. They passed the elementary school where early arriving teachers stood at the windows, watching in silent amazement. The cub led them past the last houses at the edge of town, past the park where joggers stopped mid-stride to stare, and toward a patch of woods that everyone knew was there, but nobody really noticed anymore. A forgotten green space that had somehow survived decades of development. The trees seemed to part for them, branches that should have snagged clothing instead bending gracefully aside, and the morning light filtered through the leaves in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like a path marked out in gold and shadow. The cub's pace quickened, and Lily laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed through the trees and seemed to wake something in the forest itself. Birds that should have fled at their approach instead sang louder, and Ethan could have sworn he heard other sounds too, rustlings and movements that suggested they weren't alone in these woods, that other creatures were watching their strange parade with interest rather than fear. The path, for it was definitely a path now, though none of them remembered seeing it before, wound deeper into the trees, and the sounds of the town faded away until all they could hear was their own breathing and the soft pad of the cub's paws on the forest floor. Jessica was the first to see her, though later everyone would claim they'd noticed her at the exact same moment. The mother bear stood in a small clearing, bathed in a shaft of sunlight that seemed impossibly bright for the early morning hour. She was massive compared to the cub, but there was nothing threatening in her posture, nothing that triggered the primal fear humans were supposed to feel when confronting a bear in the wild. Instead, she stood perfectly still, watching them approach with eyes that held an intelligence, a depth of understanding that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. The cub ran to her, all playfulness now, tumbling over its own feet in its eagerness to reach its mother, and the reunion was everything such moments should be, full of gentle nuzzles and soft sounds of recognition and relief. But the mother bear didn't immediately turn and disappear into the forest with her baby as they all expected. Instead, she looked directly at Lily, then at each adult in turn, her gaze lingering on each face as if memorizing it, as if saying thank you in the only way she could. Then she did something that would become legend in the town, something that would be whispered about in the coffee shop for generations to come. She walked slowly toward them, her massive form moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, and stopped just a few feet away. The cub followed, and together they sat, mother and child, facing the humans who had helped reunite them. The moment stretched, filled with a communication that needed no words, an understanding that transcended the boundaries between species. Logan would later try to explain it scientifically, talking about how the cub must have wandered into town during the night, how it could have squeezed through some impossible gap in the coffee shop's ventilation system, how the mother had probably been searching for it all night. But even as he spoke these rational words, everyone could see in his eyes that he didn't really believe them, that he knew something extraordinary had happened that morning, something that didn't fit into the neat categories of veterinary science. Jessica never even tried to explain it, simply accepting it as one of those mysteries that life occasionally offers, a gift that doesn't need to be understood to be appreciated. She had the ventilation system checked, of course, and the technician found no gap, no possible entry point for even the smallest creature, let alone a bear cub. The bears left eventually, walking back into the deeper forest with the same unhurried grace they'd shown throughout the encounter. But just before they disappeared into the shadows between the trees, the cub turned back one more time, looking directly at Lily, and made a sound that wasn't quite animal, and wasn't quite human, a sound that seemed to say thank you, and goodbye, and we'll remember all at once. Lily waved, her small hand moving slowly through the air, and then the bears were gone, leaving only the memory of their presence and the faint path through the grass where they'd walked. The group stood in silence for a long moment, each person processing what they'd witnessed in their own way, before slowly making their way back through the woods toward town. The walk back felt different, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis, showing them a view they'd never noticed before. The trees seemed more alive, the birdsong more meaningful, the very air charged with possibility. When they emerged from the woods, the town looked the same but felt different, as if by witnessing one impossible thing, they'd opened their eyes to all the other impossible things that might be happening around them every day, hidden in plain sight. The coffee shop, when they returned to it, seemed smaller somehow, more ordinary but also more special, marked now as a place where the extraordinary had touched down, however briefly. Jessica made coffee for everyone, the espresso machine working perfectly, despite its recent unusual occupant, and they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they'd experienced. Lily fell asleep in Ethan's arms, exhausted by the morning's adventure, and he sat holding her, feeling her warm weight against his chest, thinking about the world she was growing up in, a world where bear cubs could appear in coffee machines and lead you on journeys into forgotten forests. He thought about all the times he'd told her that something was impossible, all the times he'd tried to explain the rules of the world to her, and he wondered if maybe she'd had it right all along, if maybe the world was far more fluid and mysterious than he'd allowed himself to believe. Jessica sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on the counter, and he could see in her eyes that she was thinking similar thoughts, reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between the possible and impossible. As the morning wore on and the coffee shop filled with its usual customers, the story spread, but in that gentle, small-town way where extraordinary events become part of the local fabric without losing their magic. People came to look at the espresso machine, to run their fingers over the spot where the panel had opened, to sit in the chair where Jessica had held the cub. Some were skeptical, of course, but even the doubters could see something in the eyes of those who'd been there. A light that hadn't been there before. An openness to wonder that was contagious in its quiet way. The children who heard the story were the least surprised, accepting it with the same ease they accepted fairy tales and dreams, understanding instinctively that the world was far stranger and more beautiful than adults usually admitted. Logan found himself checking the woods more often, taking long walks on his lunch breaks, hoping to catch another glimpse of the bears. He never saw them again. But he found other things, tracks that didn't quite match any animal he knew, flowers that bloomed out of season, patches of warmth in the air that had no explanation. He started keeping a journal, documenting these small mysteries, not to solve them, but simply to acknowledge them, to honor their existence in a world that too often demanded explanations for everything. Savannah reorganized her bookstore's children's section, adding more books about bears and forests and magic, and found that they sold better than ever before, as if the town's children had developed a sudden hunger for stories that matched the wonder they'd glimpsed that morning. The coffee shop became a different kind of gathering place after that day, a spot where people felt comfortable sharing their own strange experiences, the things they'd seen but never mentioned for fear of being thought crazy. Michael talked about the time he'd seen lights dancing in his pharmacy after closing, moving through the aisles with purpose and intelligence. An elderly woman named Haley Dawson shared her story of finding her long-dead husband's wedding ring in her garden, placed carefully on a flower she'd planted the day after his funeral, a flower that shouldn't have bloomed for another month. These stories were met not with skepticism, but with acceptance, with the understanding that the world was layered with mysteries, that the mundane and the magical existed side by side, separated only by the thinness of perception. Ethan started bringing Lily to the coffee shop every morning, not just for coffee, but for the possibility of wonder, for the chance that something extraordinary might happen again. And while they never saw another bear cub in the espresso machine, they found other small miracles, moments of connection and beauty that might have gone unnoticed before. They saw how the steam from the coffee created patterns in the air that looked like animals and faces and landscapes. They noticed how certain customers always arrived just when they needed to meet each other, as if the coffee shop was orchestrating connections, bringing people together at exactly the right moment. They watched Lily grow, maintaining her openness to wonder even as she learned to talk and walk and navigate the world with increasing confidence. Jessica never changed anything about the espresso machine, refusing suggestions to modernize or replace it. It continued to make perfect coffee, but sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light was just right, she could swear she heard something in its operation that sounded like a heartbeat, like the machine itself was alive and remembering that morning when it had harbored something impossible. She started leaving a small dish of honey near the back door, and while she never saw who took it, it was always empty by morning, and sometimes there were tracks in the dust that looked almost but not quite like bear paws. These small mysteries became part of her routine, as essential to the coffee shop's operation as grinding beans and steaming milk. The story of the bear cub became part of the town's mythology, told and retold with small variations, each telling adding another layer of meaning. Some versions had the cub speaking to Lily in a language only children could understand. Others had the mother bear leaving a gift, a stone or a feather that granted wishes or brought good luck. But everyone who'd been there that morning knew that the truth was both simpler and more complex than any of these embellishments, that what had really happened was a moment of pure connection between different forms of life, a reminder that the boundaries we draw between ourselves and the natural world are more fluid than we imagine. They knew that the real magic wasn't in the impossibility of a bear cub in an espresso machine, but in the willingness of everyone involved to accept the impossible, to follow where it led, to allow wonder to guide them into unknown territory. Years would pass, and Lily would grow up knowing that the world was full of mysteries, that impossible things happened all the time if you were paying attention. She would become the kind of person who noticed things others missed, who saw patterns in chaos and meaning in coincidence. She would tell the story of the bear cub to her own children one day, and they would believe her, because she would tell it with the same matter-of-fact certainty that she brought to all her stories, the certainty of someone who had learned early that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than most people allowed themselves to believe. And perhaps, if they were very lucky and very observant, they would have their own encounters with the impossible, their own moments of connection with the mystery that runs beneath the surface of everyday life. The coffee shop still stands, still serves the best coffee in town, still has the same old espresso machine humming away against the wall. Jessica has grown older, but no less open to wonder, and she trains new baristas not just in the art of making coffee, but in the art of noticing, of being present for the small miracles that happen every day. She tells them the story of the bear cub, not as a legend but as a lesson, a reminder that their job is about more than serving beverages, that they're guardians of a space where the extraordinary can happen, where connections can form, where the impossible can become possible if only for a moment. And sometimes, on very quiet mornings when the mist clings to the windows and the light falls just right, if you listen very carefully to the espresso machine, you can still hear it. That soft sound that might be steam or might be something else. Something that sounds almost like a bear cub's contented sigh. The forest at the edge of town remains, protected now by an invisible understanding that some places need to be left alone, allowed to exist as bridges between worlds. Children still play at its edges, and sometimes they come back with stories of animals that walked upright, of flowers that sang, of paths that appeared and disappeared according to some pattern only the forest understood. Adults smile at these stories, but it's a different kind of smile than before, a smile that holds possibility rather than dismissal. The path the bears showed them that morning can't be found again, though many have tried, but other paths have appeared, leading to other clearings, other moments of wonder. The forest has become a reminder that there are still places where the rules are different, where magic isn't just possible but probable, where the line between dream and reality is drawn in pencil, not ink. Logan eventually wrote a paper about the experience, though he never submitted it to any journal. It sits in his desk drawer, a rambling exploration of the possibilities raised by that morning, the questions it posed about consciousness and connection, about the intelligence of nature and the nature of intelligence. He reads it sometimes, late at night when the rational world feels too small, and it reminds him that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in his veterinary philosophy. He's become known as the vet who believes in miracles, and pet owners seek him out not just for his medical expertise, but for his willingness to see their animals as more than just biological machines, to acknowledge the mystery of consciousness that looks out through every pair of eyes, human or otherwise. The town itself changed in subtle ways after that morning, became a place where the impossible felt a little more possible, where people were more willing to trust their instincts, to follow strange paths, to believe in things they couldn't explain. It wasn't that miracles happened more often, but that people noticed them more, acknowledged them, made space for them in their understanding of the world. The coffee shop became a symbol of this openness, a place where stories were shared and believed, where the extraordinary was woven into the ordinary until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Visitors to the town sometimes remarked on its unusual atmosphere, the way everyone seemed to be in on some secret, some shared understanding that made them smile at odd moments and look at ordinary things as if they might transform at any moment into something magical. And perhaps that was the real gift of the bear cub in the espresso machine, not the event itself, but what it opened up in everyone who witnessed it, the permission it gave them to believe in wonder, to expect the unexpected, to live in a world where anything could happen. It was a reminder that mystery isn't something to be solved, but something to be lived with, danced with, celebrated. It was proof that the universe has a sense of humor and a sense of timing, that it can deliver exactly what we need exactly when we need it, even if what we need is something as absurd and perfect as a bear cub in a coffee machine. It was evidence that love and connection transcend species and logic, that a toddler and a bear cub can recognize each other as kindred spirits, that a mother's gratitude can be expressed in a look that needs no translation. The morning the machine whimpered had become the morning everything changed, though the change was so gentle, so integrated into the fabric of daily life, that it felt less like a disruption and more like a remembering, as if the town had always known that such things were possible and had simply forgotten for a while. The coffee shop continued to serve its purpose, providing caffeine and comfort. But it also served as a beacon, a reminder that the extraordinary is always just one impossible moment away, waiting to break through the routine and show us that the world is far more alive and aware and interconnected than we usually allow ourselves to believe. The espresso machine continued its daily work, transforming beans and water into something more than the sum of their parts, a kind of everyday alchemy that now seemed perfectly aligned with its history as a portal for the impossible. Ethan often thought about that morning, about the way Lily had known exactly what to do, the way she'd led them all into mystery with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned to doubt. He tried to maintain that openness in his own life, to approach each day with the possibility that it might contain its own version of a bear cub in an espresso machine. He found that this attitude changed everything, made colors brighter and conversations deeper, made him notice things he'd walked past 1,000 times before. He discovered that wonder wasn't something you grew out of, but something you could grow into, that it was a choice, a practice, a way of being in the world that honored both the known and the unknown, the possible and the impossible. The story spread beyond the town, carried by visitors who'd heard it in the coffee shop, transformed and retold in ways that sometimes bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. But that didn't matter, because each version carried the essential truth, the heart of the matter, which was that the world was more magical than most people believed, that connections could form across any boundary, that help could come from the most unexpected places. The story became a seed, planted in the minds of everyone who heard it, growing into their own openness to wonder, their own willingness to believe in the impossible. It became proof that stories themselves were a kind of magic, able to change the world not through grand gestures but through the slow, patient work of changing how people saw the world. Jessica kept a photo on the wall of the coffee shop, taken that morning by someone with the presence of mind to capture the moment. It showed Lily and the cub, nose to finger, frozen in that instant of pure connection. But what the photo couldn't capture was the feeling in the room, the way time had seemed to slow down, the way everyone present had felt their hearts expand to make room for something they hadn't known they were missing. It couldn't capture the sound of the forest welcoming them, or the intelligence in the mother bear's eyes, or the way the world had felt more alive and purposeful in those moments. But for those who'd been there, the photo was enough. A touchstone, a reminder that it had really happened, that for one morning, the impossible had been not just possible but actual, present, real. The cub and its mother were never seen again, though there were reports, always unconfirmed, of bears in parts of the forest where bears shouldn't be, behaving in ways bears shouldn't behave. Children claimed to have seen them, always at a distance, always just before the bears melted back into the shadows. Adults who ventured into the woods alone sometimes felt watched, but it was a benevolent watching, a protective presence that made them feel safer rather than threatened. The forest itself seemed different, more alive, more aware, as if the bear's passage through it had awakened something that had been sleeping. Paths appeared and disappeared. Flowers bloomed out of season, and sometimes, on very still nights, you could hear sounds that might have been wind, but might have been something else. Something that sounded almost like the forest itself was breathing, was dreaming, was remembering. Lily grew up to be a wildlife biologist, surprising no one who knew her story. She studied bears, of course, but her research went beyond the conventional, exploring the edges of what science could explain about animal consciousness and communication. She never found another bear in an espresso machine, but she found other mysteries, other moments of impossible connection between humans and animals. She approached her work with the same openness she'd shown that morning as a toddler, the willingness to follow where the mystery led, even if it led beyond the boundaries of traditional science. Her colleagues sometimes called her methods unorthodox, but they couldn't argue with her results. Her ability to predict animal behavior, to understand patterns everyone else missed. She returned to the coffee shop often, even after she'd grown up and moved away for college and graduate school. She would sit in the same spot where she'd first seen the cub, drinking coffee that tasted like home and possibility. And sometimes she would tell the story to newcomers, to people who looked like they needed to hear it. She told it simply, without embellishment, the way her father had taught her to tell true stories. And she would watch their faces change as they listened, watch the skepticism give way to wonder, watch them reconsider what they thought they knew about the world. She understood that this was her real work, not the research or the papers or the degrees, but this simple act of sharing wonder, of keeping the door open between the possible and impossible. The coffee shop espresso machine finally broke down one winter morning, decades after the bear cub incident. It simply stopped working, no drama, no warning, just a quiet cessation of function that felt more like a peaceful death than a mechanical failure. Jessica stood looking at it for a long time, running her hand over its familiar surface, remembering all the years of service, all the coffee it had made, and that one impossible morning when it had been more than a machine. The repair technician who came to look at it shook his head, said it was beyond fixing, that parts for such an old model were impossible to find. But when he opened it up to disconnect it, he found something that made him step back in surprise. There, in the exact spot where the cub had been trapped, was a small tuft of brown fur, perfectly preserved, as if it had been waiting all these years to be discovered. Jessica had the machine removed but not discarded. It sits now in the town's small museum, with a placard that tells the story of the morning the machine whimpered. Visitors sometimes laugh, thinking it's a local legend, a tall tale invented to attract tourists. But the people who were there that morning know better. They know that the machine is more than a relic, that it's a reminder, a proof, a symbol of the thin places where worlds meet. The new espresso machine in the coffee shop works perfectly well, makes excellent coffee, but everyone agrees it lacks something, some indefinable quality that made the old machine special. Though sometimes, very rarely, customers report hearing something in its operation that sounds like more than just mechanical noise, as if the spirit of wonder that inhabited the old machine has found its way into the new one. The town continues to change, to grow, to modernize, but it maintains something essential from that morning, a core of belief in the extraordinary that influences everything from city planning to school curricula. Children grow up expecting wonder, looking for it, finding it in places adults have learned to overlook. The forest remains protected, officially now, designated as a preserve. Though everyone knows the real protection comes from something deeper than law, from the understanding that some places are doorways, portals, bridges between what we know and what we might discover. The coffee shop remains the heart of it all, the place where the story lives and breathes and continues to unfold, where every cup of coffee carries the possibility of transformation, where every morning might be the morning when something impossible happens again. And perhaps it has happened again in small ways, in moments that don't make it into stories but change lives nonetheless. The businessman who came in frustrated and left with a sense of peace he couldn't explain. The lonely, elderly woman who found unexpected friendship with a stranger who happened to sit at her table. The child who swears she saw the steam from the milk frother form into the shape of a bear, just for a second, just long enough to make her believe in magic. These small miracles accumulate, creating an atmosphere of possibility that draws people from miles around. People who don't quite know what they're looking for but recognize it when they find it in the warmth of the coffee shop, in the openness of its patrons, in the stories that flow as freely as the coffee. Logan retired, but never stopped walking in the woods, never stopped looking for signs of the bears. On his last walk, the day before he moved to be closer to his grandchildren, he found something that made him smile. There, in a clearing he'd passed 100 times before, was a small pile of objects, arranged with obvious intention. A coffee bean, still fragrant. A child's toy, the kind Lily used to play with. A veterinary bandage, the type he'd used to wrap the cub's injured paw. And in the center a paw print in the soft earth. Too large to be the cub's, too deliberate to be accidental. He left his own offering, his old stethoscope, the one he'd used to check the cub's heart that morning, and walked away knowing that the connection formed that day had never really ended, had just transformed into something quieter, deeper, more permanent. The story of the bear cub and the espresso machine became many stories, each one true in its own way, each one carrying the essential message that the world was fuller and stranger and more connected than most people realized. It became a story about kindness, transcending fear, about trust, overcoming logic, about the possibility that every ordinary moment might be the doorway to something extraordinary. It became a story that parents told children to help them sleep, but also to help them wake up, to help them see the world with eyes that expected wonder. It became a story that belonged to everyone who heard it, changing slightly with each telling, but never losing its heart, its core truth that one morning, in a small coffee shop, the impossible became possible, and everyone who witnessed it was changed forever. Years turned into decades, and still the story lived, passed down through generations, each one adding their own understanding, their own interpretation of what it meant. Some saw it as a reminder of humanity's connection to nature. Others saw it as proof that consciousness was more mysterious and widespread than science acknowledged. Still, others saw it simply as a beautiful story, a moment of grace in a world that often felt graceless. But for those who had been there, who had seen Lily's finger touch the cub's nose, who had felt the mother bear's gaze, who had walked that impossible path through the forest, it was simpler and more complex than any interpretation. It was just what happened one morning, when the boundaries between worlds grew thin and a bear cub found its way into an espresso machine, setting in motion a series of events that reminded everyone involved that wonder wasn't something you had to search for. It was something that found you, if you were willing to be found. The coffee shop still opens every morning at dawn, still serves the best coffee in 3 counties, still attracts people who are looking for something they can't quite name. Jessica's niece runs it now, trained in both the art of coffee and the art of noticing the impossible. She's seen her own share of mysteries, though nothing quite as dramatic as a bear cub in the espresso machine. But she's learned that the impossible comes in many forms, that wonder can be as simple as the perfect swirl of cream in coffee, as profound as the moment when strangers become friends over a shared table. She keeps the photo on the wall, tells the story when asked, and maintains the tradition of leaving honey by the back door, though she's never seen who takes it. Lily visits when she can, bringing her own children now, teaching them to look for the magic in ordinary things, to listen for the stories that objects and places want to tell. Her daughter, named Jessica after the coffee shop owner who had been so kind that morning, has her mother's gift for seeing what others miss. She claims she can hear the old espresso machine singing in the museum, that it's happy, that it's proud of its role in the story. Her son, quieter, more skeptical, still finds himself drawn to the forest, to the edges where the known world meets the unknown. He's seen things he doesn't talk about, tracks that don't match any field guide, flowers that shouldn't exist, moments of perfect stillness when the whole forest seems to be holding its breath, waiting for something wonderful to happen. The path back to wonder that the bears had shown them that morning had become a way of life for the town, a shared understanding that the miraculous was always possible, always present, always just a heartbeat away from breaking through into the ordinary world. It influenced how they raised their children, how they treated strangers, how they approached problems that seemed impossible to solve. It made them kinder, more patient, more willing to wait for solutions to reveal themselves rather than forcing them. It made them more observant, more grateful, more aware of the connections that ran between all living things like invisible threads, binding them together in a web of mutual dependence and support. The bears, wherever they were, had given them a gift that morning. Not just the gift of their presence, but the gift of possibility, the gift of wonder, the gift of remembering that the world was alive and aware and full of consciousness in forms we might not recognize but could still connect with. They had shown them that help could come from unexpected places, that communication didn't always need words, that love and gratitude and trust could cross any boundary. They had reminded them that children often knew things adults had forgotten, that innocence wasn't ignorance but a different kind of wisdom, one that didn't need to understand everything to accept everything. And so, the story continues, not ended but ongoing, living in every cup of coffee poured in that shop, in every child who grows up believing in wonder, in every adult who remembers to look for the impossible in the everyday. It lives in the forest that still keeps its secrets, in the town that learned to expect miracles, in the world that's a little more magical, because one morning, a bear cub got stuck in an espresso machine and changed everything. The machine itself, silent now in its museum case, stands as a monument to the morning when the ordinary became extraordinary, when the impossible became inevitable, when a small town learned that the boundaries between worlds were more fluid than they'd imagined, and that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very open, you might find yourself part of a story that proves the world is far more wonderful than you ever dared to believe. The morning light still comes through the coffee shop windows the same way it did that day, painting golden squares on the floor where Lily first saw the machine panel open to reveal the impossible. New customers still pause sometimes when they enter, as if sensing something special about the place, something that goes beyond good coffee and comfortable chairs. They're right to pause, to wonder, to feel that tingle of possibility that says this is a place where anything might happen. Because it is. It's a place where the extraordinary once touched down and left its mark, not just in the story everyone knows, but in the very atoms of the air, in the wood of the floors, in the steam that rises from every cup, carrying with it the memory of wonder and the promise that wonder will come again, in its own time, in its own way, when someone needs it most. The town has become known as a place where people come when they've lost their sense of wonder, when the world has become too predictable, too rational, too small. They come for the coffee, they say, or for the quiet, or for the forest walks. But really, they come for the story, for the possibility that they might have their own encounter with the impossible, their own moment when the world cracks open to reveal the magic that was always there, waiting to be noticed. Some find what they're looking for, some don't, but all leave changed in small ways, carrying with them a seed of possibility that might bloom days or years later, when they least expect it, when they most need it. The children who were there that morning are adults now, scattered across the world, but they carry the story with them, a touchstone, a reminder that they once stood in the presence of mystery and were not afraid. They tell it to their own children, to friends who need to hear it, to strangers who look lost. They tell it not as a fairy tale, but as a true story, because that's what it is, a true story about the morning when a bear cub got stuck in an espresso machine and taught a whole town that the impossible was just another word for something that hadn't happened yet. They tell it with the same wonder they felt that morning, the same awe at the way the universe sometimes arranges itself into patterns of such perfect absurdity and beauty that all you can do is accept them, celebrate them, and pass them on.